Movie Holics!
Okay, so back at it. I sent him another email again. His name is Jake, and I was really happy that I was in conversation with this guy. So I said, first off, thank you for corresponding with me at all. This kind of email is more likely to be swept under the rug by other companies, such as like a Facebook. So it's awesome to me that you, as a representative of Rotten Tomatoes, are willing to talk to me at all. Also, I tend to approach things with a very level head and enjoy discussion far more than I do hostility. That said, I must admit I can at least partially understand why someone might approach a situation with hostility. At the end of the day, a movie can live or die by the reviews on this website, and that's why it is so important to me to understand how these numbers are calculated. I can't help but feel that there's an issue with the way data is calculated by Rotten Tomatoes, and I do have some follow-up questions to your response. My first question is, why would Rotten Tomatoes allow any reviews that do not definitely say it's good or bad? I still don't really have a great answer to that question either. It seems to me that leaving open any interpretation by an editor at Rotten Tomatoes would leave the reputation of the company at risk virtually all the time. I understand taking pride in what you do. I understand having integrity. But there has to have been at least one scenario where a critic could say the movie was okay and an editor interpreted that as a negative review because the editor did not personally like the movie. So again, why allow for this situation at all? Why not only use critics where the critic says, go see this, or don't go see this? From my perspective, Rotten Tomatoes calculates numbers. Numbers aren't open to interpretation, so adding an editor's interpretation leaves the integrity of the review open to microscopic inspection. Clearly, you know this, as you've already said that this is not your first email involving this topic. I continue. Moving on. It's exactly what I said. Moving on. It's nice to know that you take the next step in contacting the critic. My question here is why allow it to get to that point at all? Rotten Tomatoes and the critic have a symbiotic relationship. You drive traffic to your site with their reviews, and their reviews are seen because of the vast number of reviews that you host. Why not take interpretation out of it and make the critic give the movie a thumbs up or thumbs down themselves? I'm certain that this is for fear of what I will call review drop-off. As in, Rotten Tomatoes could be fearful that they wouldn't get the participation rate that they have now, which is probably true, but that only stands to strengthen the reputation of the company. Moving on. In your response, you said, and I quote the Roger Ebert thing, where it was about the 2.54, or 2.5 out of 4, so on and so forth. So, let me rephrase. I quote where he said that Roger Ebert's 2.5 out of 4 is fresh versus Roger Moore's 2.5 out of 4 is rotten. Sorry, I got that backwards. Roger Ebert's was rotten and Roger Moore's was fresh. And I said, that's insane. This basically means that the reader, me, has to look at a 2.5 out of 4 from one critic that is fresh and figure out why a 2.5 out of 4 rating from another critic is rotten. It isn't shocking to me that your general audience of readers have responded negatively and with hostility, considering the general audience will threaten to kill my family if I don't know every detail involving Superman's death from Rogue issue 12 of the Dark DC comic book series. And I said, I joke, I made that up, but you get my point. On the same topic, you said, I'm a little unclear what you mean when you say that these reviews with disparate rating systems are being lumped in together. Because what ultimately matters is whether or not the individual rating methods translate to a fresh tomato or rotten splat. And we take each review one at a time. Sorry, I'm going to get through this. My point is, how does the audience know? How does the audience know? After all, Rotten Tomatoes is a website for the general public. It doesn't exist so that I, as a critic, can decide if I should go see a film. So why does Rotten Tomatoes making it so difficult for the audience why does Rotten Tomatoes make it so difficult for the audience you're trying to bring in? Case in point, and my printer kind of blew at this, but I listed 4 Rotten Tomatoes reviews here, right? Yeah, 4. And I said, these are 4 different reviews on Furious 7. You'll notice that the first review has a 3 out of 5 rating, the next is a 3 out of 4, the next a B, and the next nothing. all have a fresh rating, yet it's unclear to the audience why the scoring criteria changes from one critic to the next. I understand that this is because each critic is using their own method of measurement, but that brings me back full circle to why allow those different ratings to show on your website at all if you're only using binary anyways? If you're only using thumbs up and thumbs down data, fresh or rotten data, to calculate whether or not a review is positive, why are you allowing these different scoring methods on the website? It's fucking confusing. As I approach the end of the email, I must apologize, as you did, for the length. I don't reach a broad audience, but the audience I do reach expects me to deliver clear and accurate content and hope for the same from Rotten Tomatoes. And I hope for the same from Rotten Tomatoes. I realize about 99% of this email has nothing to do with you, and in all likelihood, there's nothing you can do to change it. But if you have answers to my above questions, I welcome them, so on and so forth. Sincerely, Kyler Wilson. All right, so your response. Says, thanks again for a thoughtful response. I'll do my best to address your concerns you outlined, and even if you disagree with our process, I hope I can shed some light on why we do what we do in the way that we do it. I gotta go on record and say, this series of videos could have ended far more negatively. Still not positive, because I seriously have a problem with the way Rotten Tomatoes is doing this, but this guy, this representative, Jake, I believe I named him, at Rotten Tomatoes, ensured that these videos weren't as drastically negative as they could have been, because I was a little pissed off. I was keeping my cool and everything, but I was a little pissed off because I'm like, you're lying. I feel like you're lying to people. That's what I feel like. I feel like you're absolutely misleading the public. And I love movies. So if there's one thing I don't want people misled on, it's movies, right? So that being said, he continues. He says, I'll begin by saying that our unofficial goal with Rotten Tomatoes has always been to encourage moviegoers to read, engage, and be exposed to more film criticism than they otherwise might have been before. As Rotten Tomatoes grew over the years, I think the way the general public began to utilize our site gradually molded the public perception that we are a utility, something the casual moviegoer brings up on their phone as they're standing in line on a Friday night trying to decide what to see. Even the corporate entities who have managed us over the years have referred to us this way, and we here at the editorial staff have always kind of resented that. It's easy to look back now and think, well, of course that's how people were going to view the site. We have a tomato meter. But the mentality in the early days of Rotten Tomatoes was essentially, come for the tomato meter score, but stay for the reviews. In fact, the origin story of Rotten Tomatoes was that way back in 1998 or 99, a couple of guys were interested in seeing Rush Hour, but they had so much trouble finding reviews of the movie that they decided to whip together a website that would collect movie reviews in one place for prospective moviegoers to see what critics were saying about new releases. In other words, in an ideal world, our hope was that people wouldn't simply glance at a tomato meter score and hurry off to watch a movie. We hoped that by prominently featuring review excerpts and links back to the full text, moviegoers would be compelled to actually read more of these reviews. We know now more than ever that the ultra convenience of the tomato meter score often works against that goal, but our hope is that we have, over the years, played some part in keeping film journalism alive, and that's always been a big priority for us, if not the main priority. It's always been reassuring to us when we get emails or comments from users who have actually read through reviews and have things to say about them, even if they're negative. So I gotta say, those two paragraphs started flipping my perception quite a bit. I won't get into it. I'll just read my response email in the next video, but let me continue this. The reason I start with this is because that philosophy informs everything else we do. We want people to read and be exposed to good film criticism. The reason we include reviews that do not, for example, utilize a rating system to clearly define whether a film is good or bad is because if we removed all the publications that didn't have a rating system, we wouldn't have the New York Times, the LA Times, Variety, the Hollywood Reporter, the Village Voice, and any number of other publications where some of the nation's most esteemed film journalists are published. I'm not sure we would be viewed with any amount of credibility if we didn't include the likes of Anthony Lane, Manala Dargis, Jay Hoberman, Wesley Morris, etc. Once we've established that we need to include the important works of those critics, the only option we have is to analyze those reviews ourselves when we include them on our site. Of course, we also realize that any process like this is going to be vulnerable to human error, which is why we employ an entire team to act as a system of checks and balances against each other. And it's also why we do our best to foster personal relationships with critics so that we can reach out to them when we need to. This is also the reason why we encourage as many critics as we can to submit their own reviews to Rotten Tomatoes. We have a system set up for that. If they are the ones choosing their quotes and fresh and rotten designations themselves, then there's no wiggle room there. Of course, aside from the most prominent publications like the ones we mentioned above, the vast majority of approved critics featured on Rotten Tomatoes actually do self-submit their reviews, which is good to know. I'm not sure we could convince writers like the ones mentioned above to adopt a definitive thumbs up or thumbs down policy, but even if some of them were willing to do that, we'd never presume to dictate the editorial standards and practices of long-standing publications like, say, the New York Times. We've achieved a modicum of influence in the movie industry at large, to be sure, but not nearly enough to ask for anything like that. And believe me, based on years of correspondence with these critics and publications, there's no way they would change the way that they do things for us. We're still small potatoes. And he puts in little parentheses, tomatoes? Question marks. You also expressed some exasperation for my example from up on Poppy Hill. And he quotes me again, so let me just skip past that. Oh, actually, it's actually important. I said, this means that the reader, me, has to look at a 2.5 out of 4 rating from one critic that is fresh and figure out why a 2.5 out of 4 rating from the other critic is rotten. He says, going back to the first 2 paragraphs of this email, that's exactly what we want people to do. He's saying they want people to look at those and try to figure out what the difference is. If the example I provided made a casual moviegoer scratch his head and prompted him to read both reviews to figure out why one was rated one way and one was rated differently, then we've done exactly what we set out to do. We want people to recognize and understand that film criticism isn't a simple science, that a mixed review can mean different things to different critics. In your next point, you question the inclusion of individual rating systems at all on our site. I understand where you're coming from, but I tend to disagree about how confusing they are for the general user. I don't believe it's difficult to look at the example you provided and figure out that those ratings are specific to those critics and public outlets. The reason we include them is to provide an extra layer of context. It's true, our binary fresh or rotten tomato meter is the core of what we do, but we can include an individual rating that further contextualizes why a given review is marked fresh or rotten. It can help alleviate a lot of ambiguity in the process. For what it's worth, 3 or 4 reviews in the screenshot you included, 3 of the 4 reviews in the screenshot you included were self-submitted by the critics themselves. As I mentioned earlier, it's always encouraging when we receive emails like yours because it tells us people care about what we do and how we do it, and the people are looking critically at our website. That's never a bad thing. I hope I've helped further explain why we do things the way we do, and I hope that this all makes some sense. Of course, if you have any other questions or concerns, I'll gladly hear them. Thanks for writing, Jake, Rotten Tomatoes. All right, so that was a huge chunk. I really like a lot of the things that he said. I won't read my email on this episode, but suffice it to say, I really enjoyed a lot of the things he said, but I still disagree with the idea that, critics wouldn't participate. Some critics wouldn't participate, so on and so forth. I think that there's a better way to do what they do. And I think there's a better way to make it easier for the viewer. And I'll get into all that in the next episode. So, what do you guys think of this? Are you enjoying these videos at all? If not, let me know. If so, let me know. Either way, I'm gonna finish it out. That's all I got, guys. Appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you next time. Deuces.